Hi everyone, welcome to today's lesson. It's going to be our final session working on this low-key landscape. So if you remember in the last two sessions, we spent the first session blocking in. So we blocked in all the general shapes and values in the painting. Second session we just went in and added detail, so things like these treetops. And this final session, if you have a look over at the reference, which is up on the screen, next to the video, you'll see there's some kind of golden lights placed sort of along the edge of this lakeside, or riverside, or probably a lake. And we're going to try to get them in today, which will just add like a nice little bit of kind of tiny points of contrast within this generally quite somber painting. But it can be a bit tricky to do that, so obviously you're laying over kind of yellows and oranges into this sort of bluish scene, and we kind of don't want to mix. Obviously, you don't want to mix the yellow into the blue because it would make a green, and we don't want a greenishness. So we're actually not going to add any kind of new tones to the blues in this this session. We're just going to be working with these tiny little points of light. So I'll be repeating it, and it's a useful thing, like if you're doing interiors or landscapes, still lifes. If you're ever painting lights, you'll find this a good approach to getting a nice kind of luminous glow. But first things first, I've noticed looking at my painting, and you might be able to see a bit on screen, that there is a little bit of what's called sinking in. So some parts of the painting have just faded a little bit, particularly in the darks, because the paint has been sort of absorbed by the surface and become more matte, less glossy. So the first thing I want to do is get my medium, which today is kind of a half-half mixture of linseed oil and mineral spirits. And it's almost like varnishing, but you'll see, hopefully you can see depending on how dark my video is this evening, that as I add that, so if I add that just to this left hand side of the painting, how much more intense and vivid those colours go. So I'm just going to add medium all over the surface. I'm only just lightly dipping it in and then spreading it as far as I possibly can, because you don't need a lot to cover the surface of the image. But you do want it to spread everywhere it needs to go. There's a lot of detail in these foreground trees. It's only just starting to emerge now as I add this resaturating coat. So that's not too bad. Just kind of made it more intense. Back to how it was last week when I was working. So I can put that larger brush away. I'm only going to be using tiny brushes for now. Probably my tiniest brush. I'm just using this really tiny little thin brush. You can see how small it is. I'm going to start and I'm going to work along the edge. So I'm going to create the highlights as kind of points of light along the shoreline, and then we want to get the reflections in as well, because that'll really amplify the kind of the sense that this is a body of water. So the first thing I'm doing is I'm using yellow ochre, which is kind of like an almost orangey yellow. Yellow ochre mixed with a tiny bit of cadmium red. So I'm going to get a tiny bit of that on my brush, and I'm going to put a little dot just here. But it's going to be bigger than the eventual light that I'm placing, because we're working from a kind of less a less bright color, and we're going to build over the top of that, slowly build it into a more intense point of light, and eventually end with just pure white. So let's work initially on the lights that run along the shoreline. So there's one brighter light, and then there's kind of like 5 lights in a row. And they're all slightly separated like that. So this isn't very apparent yet, but that's the idea. Then we want a reflection for each of those, so kind of fading down into the lake. That's not too bad. So we've got our base color. So now I'm going to get cadmium yellow. I'm going to mix that cadmium yellow into that yellow ochre cad red mixture, and I'm going to start laying that new mixture inside those halo colors. So you can see why I'm using such a tiny brush. And with the reflections, it's going to be, they kind of blurred down into the water. They're going to be brighter up the top than they are down the bottom. Just trying to give a sense of it fading down. Let's add those brush strokes in. Now I just want these halos to just extend a bit further than they already do. Something like that seems a little bit better. I'm going to give my brush a little bit of a clean and wipe off. Then I'm going to pick up some pure cadmium yellow, so not mixed in at all with the yellow ochre and cad red. And I also want it to be fairly thick. This has to be impastode on, so that means you're adding, obviously it's not a ton of paint because it's such a small point, but you kind of want to build the physicality of the paint up. So something like that. So you kind of scoop it up, try to get a reasonably thick point on your brush. Sometimes it works to just kind of stab your brush into the pool of paint, so I'm kind of scooping up a good amount of cad yellow on my brush and then just laying down a good little wad of it. So it kind of pretty much sort of sticks off the surface of the painting if I do it this way, and that's what I'm after. So that creates a bold enough amount of paint to really shine out nicely from those blues. So I can do the same thing with my reflections, so I want to get it thicker at the top and then just sort of dragging down. And then finally, I'm going to clean my brush off again and do the same thing, but this time picking up white paint. And I want to get a little dab of white paint just inside, or roughly within the center of that yellow paint. Just want to drag that cad yellow a bit further down, so I'm picking up a little bit more cad yellow again, dragging it down. It's a bit better. I might go back to my yellow ochre mix and just drag that further down as well, just to really make it feel like it's fading down into the river, which is quite, or into the lake, which is quite nice. So that's worked pretty well. Could maybe do with a little bit more of a halo of cad yellow, so I'm just going to do that now. So I'm cleaning off my brush a lot as I'm doing this. Yeah, it's not too bad. So I'm gonna simplify a little bit what we're doing, because there's no need to overdo this. But we're gonna put one more point kind of in the middle here, and we're gonna do this little cluster which is kind of between the buildings, and then do some of these individual points. And there's also some slightly more reddish bits of light just in here which we'll go for, just because it can be nice to look for a little bit of variety. Speaking of reddishness, I noticed that the kind of tail end of these reflections, they feel more kind of reddish, I guess. So I've just mixed a little bit of cad red into them, a bit more cad red, which I think works a little bit better. So going back to the beginning, we've got a little bit more of our cad red yellow ochre. Put a single point here. Can make it a little bit bigger because we ended up enlarging it last time. Something like that. Then get its reflection down into the water. And then same thing for this group over here. And back to our cad yellow. It's a nice little group. And getting our reflections, so working the same way. Stretch that down a bit into the water below. Again, it goes kind of orangey, so we're going to get a little bit of cad red. Let them kind of intermingle a little bit as well. There's not much of a division between the lights up top, so we want to make sure the reflections match that. Reflections always need to feel like they combine. So that's our yellows in. Clean my brush off again. Get some white. Get that white in the center of. Those yellows. Get to drag down. Yeah, it's looking pretty good. A tiny little, nice little light in behind here as well. Which, as we're moving along quite quickly, I'll add that in as well. That's pretty nice. Just a nice little contrast behind those trees. This one looks a little bit too white, so I'm actually going to go in and just mix a little bit of CAD yellow into that. That looks a bit better. So we've now got all these points of light kind of dotted around this hillside. So they're a little bit closer to us. I'm going to go straight in. They're a little bit more orange, so I'm going to mix my CAD red and CAD yellow, cadmium yellow. And then just kind of dot across the mountainside, just a little bit smaller as well. So we're going to put just little dots around. Don't do so much of a halo for these ones. Two that kind of sit down by the lakeside, and there's a few dotted around the hillside as well. Anyway, a little bit more orange. I just want to try to give a sense of that. Maybe even using some pure CAD red. I like that. Possibly feel a bit more orange just because they're a little bit closer to us, and it might be something to do with how the light disappears as it moves further back. Just want to make sure there's enough body to the center of these lights. If the paint's too transparent, then we lose some of that saturation chroma in the paint. So we want to make sure we've got a thick enough sort of wad of cadmium in the center of these lights. Oh, we want some of these little reflections as well, because these ones nearer to us do have reflections. Oh, sorry, not nearer to us, but right down the center of the, sorry, down the bottom of that shoreline. So we've got our colours in, so again I'm going to clean my brush off, pick up a little kind of peak. It's almost like kind of like an ice cream cone. You want to try to pick up a little peak of light, of white, and you just kind of touch the tip of it to the surface of the canvas. It creates a nice little, very thick piece of light. You pretty much have to pick it up every time you add a new one, because when you add it, it's almost like the point of a pencil. You lose it. There we go. So that's looking pretty good. Fairly happy with the sense of those lights. Working well with the reflections and the shoreline, and they certainly bring kind of the whole piece together. Give it a bit more warmth, which is nice. Slightly more interest, gives you a kind of some point of contrast within something that's this kind of low key, which is good. And it's a nice little light effect. So yeah, it's mostly what you're thinking about with this lesson is just how that effect works. As I say, you can apply the same sort of effect in terms of creating highlights with points of light, with highlights on pieces of metal, lights within interior scenes, even if you're like painting portraits that have, say, lights behind the subject. There's loads of uses for that little technique, but the main thing is making sure you have a lot of paint on the tip of the brush. Not mixing too much, so like you wouldn't want to do that over a wet background, because those yellows would start to mix with the blue immediately, and you'd end up with a mucky brush, and it just wouldn't work. So it's better to just lay it over something that's dried like this. But yeah, that's pretty much it. We're done with this piece for now, so we'll be starting something new next week. But yeah, have a go at your own low-key piece. When you're done, you can message on here, or you can follow through the OCAD link to sign up and get tutoring from myself and other teachers on the site. And you can look at all our archive of videos as well. So yeah, I'll see you guys next week for a new project.